On a minor but respectable plaza in the imperial city sat, or perhaps lounged, Lord Vannick's building commission. It was an unimaginative, austere building, not noted so much for its aesthetic or architectural design as for its prodigious length. If any critics wondered why such an unornamented, extended erection held such fascination for Lord Vannick, they kept it to themselves. In the 398th year of the Third Era, Decimus Scotti was a senior clerk at the Commission. It had been a few months since the shy, middle-aged man had brought Lord Vannick the most lucrative of all contracts, granting the Commission the exclusive right to rebuild the roads of Valenwood, which had been destroyed in the 5-year war. For this, he had become the darling of the managers and the clerks, spending his days recounting his adventures, more or less faithfully, although he did omit the ending of the tale, since many of them had partaken in the celebratory Unthrapper roast provided by the Silenstre. Informing one's listeners that they've gorged on human flesh improves very few stories of any good taste. Scotti was neither particularly ambitious nor hard-working, so he did not mind that Lord Vannick had not given him anything to actually do. Whenever the squat little gnomish man would happen upon Decimus Scotti in the offices, Lord Vannick would always say, "You're a credit to the Commission. Keep up the good work." In the beginning, Scotti had worried that he was supposed to be doing something, but as the months went on, he merely replied, "Thank you, I will." There was, on the other hand, the future to consider. He was not a young man, and though he was receiving a respectable salary for someone not doing actual work, Scotti considered that soon he might have to retire and not get paid for not doing work. It would be nice, he decided, if Lord Vannick, out of gratitude for the millions of gold the Valenwood contract was generating, might deign to make Scotti a partner. Or, at least, give him a small percentage of the bounty. Decimus Scotti was no good at asking for things like that, which was one of the reasons why, previous to his signal successes in Valenwood as a senior clerk for Lord Atreus, he was a lousy agent. He had just about made up his mind to say something to Lord Vannick when his lordship unexpectedly pushed things along. "You're a credit to the Commission," the waddling little thing said, and then paused. "Do you have a moment free on your schedule?" Scotti nodded eagerly and followed his lordship to his hideously decorated and very enviable hectare of office space. "Zenithar blesses us for your presence at the Commission," the little fellow squeaked grandly. "I don't know whether you know this, but we were having a bad time before you came along. We had impressive projects, for certain, but they were not successful. In Black Marsh, for example, for years we've been trying to improve the roads and other routes of travel for commerce. I put my best man, Flesus Tijo, on it, but every year, despite staggering investments of time and money, the trade along those routes only gets slower and slower. Now we have your very clean, very profitable Valenwood contract to boost the Commission's profits. I think it's time you were rewarded." Scotti grinned a grin of great modesty and subtle avarice. "I want you to take over the Black Marsh account from Flesus Tijo." Scotti shook as if awaking from a pleasant dream to hideous reality. "My lord, I couldn't—" "Nonsense," chirped Lord Vannick. "Don't worry about Tijo. He will be happy to retire on the money I give him, particularly as soul-wrenchingly difficult as this Black Marsh business has been. Just your sort of a challenge, my dear Decimus." Scotti couldn't utter a sound, though his mouth feebly formed the word "no" as Lord Vannick brought out the box of documentation on Black Marsh. "You're a fast reader," Lord Vannick guessed. "You can read it all en route." "En route to Black Marsh, of course," the tiny fellow giggled. "You are a funny chap. Where else would you go to learn about the work that's being done and how to improve it?" The next morning, the stack of documentation hardly touched, Decimus Scotti began the journey southeast to Black Marsh. Lord Vannick had hired an able-bodied guard, a rather taciturn red guard named Malik, to protect his best agent. They rode south along the Niben and then southeast along the Silverfish, continuing on into the wilds of Cyrodiil, where the river tributaries had no names, and the very vegetation seemed to come from another world than the nice, civilized gardens of the northern imperial province. Scotty's horse was tied to Malik's, so the clerk was able to read. It made it difficult to pay attention to the path they were taking, but Scotty knew he needed at least a cursory familiarity with the Commission's business dealings in Black Marsh. It was a huge box of paperwork going back 40 years, when the Commission had first been given several million in gold by a wealthy trader, Lord Zelicles Pinos Revina, to improve the condition of the road from Gideon to Cyrodiil. At that time, it took 3 weeks, a preposterously long time, for the rice and root he was importing to arrive, half-rotten, in the imperial province. Pinos Revina was long dead, but many other investors over the decades, including Pelagius IV himself, had hired the Commission to build roads, drain swamps, construct bridges, devise anti-smuggling systems, hire mercenaries, and, in short, do everything that the greatest empire in history knew would work to aid trade with Black Marsh. According to the latest figures, the result of this was that it took 2.5 months for goods, now thoroughly rotten, to arrive. Scotty found that when he looked up after concentrating on what he was reading, the landscape had always changed, always dramatically, always for the worse. "This is Blackwood, sir," said Malik to Scotty's unspoken question. It was dark and woodsy, so Decimus Scotty thought that a very appropriate name. The question he longed to ask, which in due course he did ask, was, "What's that terrible smell?" "Slav Point, sir," Malik replied as they turned the next bend, where the umbrageous tunnel of tangled tree and vine opened to a clearing. There squatted a cluster of formal buildings in the dreary imperial design, favoured by Lord Vannick's commission and every emperor since Tiber, together with a stench so eye-blindingly, stomach-wrenchingly awful that Scotty wondered suddenly if it were deadly poisonous. The swarms of blood-coloured, sand-grain-sized insects obscuring the air did not improve the view. Scotty and Malik batted at the buzzing clouds as they rode their horses towards the largest of the buildings, which on approach revealed itself to be perched at the edge of a thick, black river. From its size and serious aspect, Scotty guessed it to be the Census and Excise Office for the wide, white bridge that stretched across the burbling dark water to the reeds on the other side. It was a very nice, bright, sturdy-looking bridge, built, Scotty knew, by his commission. A poxy, irritable official opened the door quickly on Scotty's first knock. Come in quickly! Don't let the flesh flies in!" "Flesh flies?" Decimus Scotty trembled. "You mean they eat human flesh?" "If you're fool enough to stand around and let them," the soldier said, rolling his eyes. He had half an ear, and Scotty, looking around at the other soldiers in the fort, noted that they all were well chewed. One of them had no nose at all to speak of. "Now, what's your business?" Scotty told them, and added that if they stood outside the fortress instead of inside, they might catch more smugglers. "You better be more concerned with getting across that bridge," the soldier sneered. "Tide's coming up, and if you don't get a move on, you won't get to Black Marsh for 4 days." That was absurd. A bridge swamped by a rising tide on a river. Only the look in the soldier's eyes told Scotty he wasn't joking. Upon stepping out of the fort, he saw that the horses, evidently tired of being tortured by the flesh flies, had ripped free of their restraints and were bounding off into the woods. The oily water of the river was already lapping on the planks, oozing between the crevices. Scotty reflected that perhaps he would be more than willing to endure a wait of 4 days before going to Black Marsh, but Malik was already running across. Scotty followed him, wheezing. He was not in excellent shape, and never had been. The box of commission materials was heavy. Halfway across he paused to catch his breath, and then discovered he could not move. His feet were stuck. The black mud that ran through the river was a thick, gluey paste, and having washed over the plank Scotty was on, it held his feet fast. Panic seized him. Scotty looked up from his trap and saw Malik leaping from plank to plank ahead of him, closing fast on the reeds on the other side. "Help!" Scotty cried. "I'm stuck!" Malik did not even turn around, but kept jumping. "I know, sir, you need to lose weight." Decimus Scotti knew he was a few pounds over and had meant to start eating less and exercising more, but embarking on a diet hardly seemed to promise timely aid in his current predicament. No diet on Nern would have helped him just then. However, on reflection, Scotti realized that the Red Guard intended that he drop the box of documents, for Malik was no longer carrying any of the essential supplies he had had with him previously. With a sigh, Scotti threw the box of commission notes into the glop and felt the plank under him rise 1/4 of an inch, just enough to free him from the mud's clutches. With an agility born of extreme fear, Scotti began leaping after Malik, dropping onto every third plank and springing up before the river gripped him. In 46 leaps, Decimus Scotti crashed through the reeds onto the solid ground behind Malik and found himself in Black Marsh. He could hear behind him a slurping sound as the bridge and his container of important and official records of commission affairs was consumed by the rising flood of dark filth, never to be seen again. Decimus Scotti emerged from the dirt and reeds, exhausted from running, his face and arms sheathed in red flesh flies. Looking back toward Cyrodiil, he saw the bridge disappear beneath the thick black river, and he knew he was not getting back until the tide went down in a few days' time. The river also held in its adhesive depths his files on the Black Marsh account. He would have to rely on his memory for his contacts in Gideon. Malik was purposefully striding through the reeds ahead. Flailing ineffectually at the flesh flies, Scotti hurried after him. "We're lucky, sir," said the Red Guard, which struck Scotti as an extraordinarily odd thing to say, until his eyes followed where the man's finger was pointing. "The caravan is here." 21 rusted, mud-spattered wagons with rotting wood and wobbly wheels sat half-sunk in the soft earth ahead. A crowd of Argonians, grey-scaled and grey-eyed, the sort of sullen manual labourers that were common in Cyrodiil, pulled at one of the wagons which had been detached from the others. As Scotti and Malik came closer, they saw it was filled with a cargo of black berries so decayed that they had become hardly recognisable, more a festering jelly than a wagon-load of fruit. Yes, they were going to the city of Gideon, and yes, they said, Scotti could get a ride with them after they were finished unloading this shipment of lumberies. "How long ago were they picked?" Scotti asked, looking at the wagon's rotten produce. "The harvest was in last seed, of course," said the Argonian, who seemed to be in charge of the wagon. It was now sun's dusk, so they had been en route from the fields for a little over 2 months. Clearly, Scotti thought, there were problems with transportation, but fixing that, after all, was what he was doing here, as a representative of Lord Vannick's building commission. It took close to an hour of the berries rotting even more in the sun for the wagon to be pushed to the side, the wagons in front of it and behind it to be attached to one another, and one of the 8 horses from the front of the caravan to be brought around to the now independent wagon. The labourers moved with dispirited lethargy, and Scotti took the opportunity to inspect the rest of the caravan and talk to his fellow travellers. 4 of the wagons had benches in them, fit for uncomfortable riders. All the rest were filled with grain, meat, and vegetation in various stages of corruption. The travellers consisted of the 6 Argonian labourers, 3 imperial merchants so bug-bitten that their skin looked as scaly as the Argonians themselves, and 3 cloaked fellows who were evidently Dunmer, judging by the red eyes that gleamed in the shadows under their hoods. All were transporting their goods along this, the Imperial Commerce Road. "This is a road?" Scotti exclaimed, looking at the endless field of reeds that reached up to his chin or higher. "It's solid ground of a sort," one of the hooded Dunmer shrugged. "The horses eat some of the reed, and sometimes we set fire to it, but it just grows right back up." Finally, the wagon master signalled that the caravan was ready to go, and Scotti took a seat in the 3rd wagon with the other Imperials. He looked around, but Malik was not on board. "I agreed to get you to Black Marsh and take you back out," said the Red Guard. who had plumped down on a rock in the sea of reeds and was munching on a hairy carrot. "I'll be here when you get back." Scotty frowned, and not only because Malik had dropped the deferential title Sir while addressing him. Now he truly knew no one in Black Marsh, but the caravan slowly grinded and bumped forward, so there was no time to argue. A noxious wind blew across the Commerce Road, casting patterns in the endless, featureless expanse of reeds. In the distance, there seemed to be mountains, but they constantly shifted, and Scotty realized they were banks of mist and fog. Shadows flitted across the landscape, and when Scotty looked up, he saw they were being cast by giant birds with long, saw-like beaks, nearly the size of the rest of their bodies. Hackwings, Cairo Gemulus, an imperial on Scotty's left, who might have been young but looked old and beaten, muttered, "Like everything else in this damnable place, they'll eat you if you don't keep moving. Beggars pounce down and give you a nasty chop, and then fly off and come back when you're mostly dead from blood loss." Scotty shivered. He hoped they'd be in Gideon before nightfall. It was then it occurred to him that the sun was on the wrong side of the caravan. "Excuse me, sir," Scotty called to the wagon master. "I thought you said we were going to Gideon." The wagon master nodded. "Why are we going north then, when we should be going south?" There was no reply but a sigh. Scotty confirmed with his fellow travellers that they too were going to Gideon, and none of them seemed very concerned about the circuitous route to getting there. The seats were hard on his middle-aged back and buttocks, but the bumping rhythm of the caravan and the hypnotic waving reeds gradually had an effect on him, and Scotty drifted off to sleep. He awoke in the dark some hours later, not sure where he was. The caravan was no longer moving, and he was on the floor, under the bench, next to some small boxes. There were voices, speaking a hissing, clicking language Scotty didn't understand, and he peeked out between someone's legs to see what was happening. The moons barely pierced the thick mist surrounding the caravan, and Scotty did not have the best angle to see who was talking. For a moment, it looked like the grey wagon master was talking to himself, but the darkness had movement and moisture, in fact, glistening scales. It was hard to tell how many of these things there were, but they were big, black, and the more Scotty looked at them, the more details he could see. When one particular detail emerged, huge mouths filled with dripping needle-like fangs, Scotty slipped back under the bench. Their black little eyes had not fallen on him yet. The legs in front of Scotty moved and then began to thrash as their owner was grabbed and pulled out of the wagon. Scotty crouched further back, getting behind the little boxes. He didn't know much about concealment, but had some experience with shields. He knew that having something, anything, in between you and bad things was always good. A few seconds after the legs had disappeared from sight, there was a horrible scream, and then a second and a third, different timbres, different accents, but the same inarticulate message: terror and pain, horrible pain. Scotty remembered a long-forgotten prayer to the god Stendar and whispered it to himself. Then there was silence, ghastly silence that lasted only a few minutes, but which seemed like hours, years, and then the carriage started rolling forward again. Scotty cautiously crawled out from under the carriage. Cairo Gemulus gave him a bemused grin. "There you are," he said. "I thought the Nagas took you." "Nagas? Nasty characters," Gemulus said, frowning. "Puff-adders with legs and arms, 7 feet tall, 8 when they're mad. Come from the inner swamp, and they don't like it here much, so they're particularly peevish. You're the kind of posh imperial they're looking for." Scotty had never in his life thought of himself as posh. His mud and flesh, fly-bespeckled clothing seemed eminently middle-class at best to him. "What would they want me for?" "To rob, of course," the imperial smiled, "and to kill. You didn't notice what happened to the others?" The imperial frowned, as if struck by a thought. "You didn't sample from those boxes down below, did you? Like the sugar, do you?" "Gods, no," Scotty grimaced. The imperial nodded, relieved. "You just seem a little slow. First time to Black Marsh, I gather? Oh, hi, ho, hist, piss!" Scotty was just about to ask Gemulus what that vulgar term meant when the rain began. It was an inferno of foul-smelling, yellow-brown rain that washed over the caravan, accompanied by the growl of thunder in the distance. Gemulus worked to pull the roof up over the wagon, glaring at Scotty until he helped with the laborious process. He shuddered, not only from the cold damp, but from contemplation of the disgusting precipitation pouring down on the already nasty produce in the uncovered wagon. "We'll be dry soon enough," Gemulus smiled, pointing out into the fog. Scotty had never been to Gideon, but he knew what to expect. A large settlement more or less laid out like an imperial city, with more or less imperial-style architecture and all the imperial comforts and traditions, more or less. The jumble of huts, half sunk in mud, was decidedly less. "Where are we?" asked Scotty, bewildered. "Hixinoag," replied Gemulus, pronouncing the queer name with confidence. "You were right. We were going north when we should have been going south." Decimus Scotty was supposed to be in Gideon, a thoroughly imperialized city in southern Black Marsh, arranging business dealings to improve commerce in the province on behalf of Lord Vannick's building commission and its clients. Instead, he was in a half-submerged, rotten little village called Hixinoag, where he knew no one, except for a drug smuggler named Gemulus. Gemulus was not at all perturbed that the merchant caravan had gone north instead of south. He even let Scotty share his bucket of troth, tiny little crunchy fish he had bought from the villagers. Scotty would have preferred them cooked, or at any rate dead, but Gemulus blithely explained that dead cooked troth are deadly poison. "If I were where I was supposed to be," Scotty pouted, putting one of the wriggling little creatures in his mouth, "I could be having a roast and some cheese and a glass of wine." "I sell moon sugar in the north and buy it in the south," he shrugged. "You have to be more flexible, my friend." "My only business is in Gideon," Scotty frowned. "Well, you have a couple choices," replied the smuggler. "You could just stay here. Most villages in Argonia don't stay put for very long, and there's a good chance Hixinoag will drift right down to the gates of Gideon. Might take you a month or two. Probably the easiest way. That'd put me far behind schedule." "Next option, you could join up with the caravan again," said Gemulus. "They might be going in the right direction this time, and they might not get stuck in the mud, and they might not be all murdered by Naga highwaymen." "Not tempting," Scotty frowned. "Any other ideas?" "Ride the routes. The Underground Express," Gemulus grinned. "Follow me." Scotty followed Gemulus out of the village and into a copse of trees, shrouded by veils of wispy moss. The smuggler kept his eye on the ground, poking at the viscous mud intermittently. Finally, he found a spot which triggered a mass of big, oily bubbles to rise to the surface. "Perfect," he said. "Now, the important thing is not to panic. The express will take you due south. That's the wintertide migration, and you'll know you're near Gideon when you see a lot of red clay. Just don't panic, and when you see a mass of bubbles, that's a breathing hole you can use to get out." Scotty looked at Gemulus blankly. The man was talking perfect gibberish. "What?" Gemulus took Scotty by the shoulder and positioning him on top of the mass of bubbles. "You stand right here." Scotty sank quickly into the mud, staring at the smuggler, horror-struck. "And remember to wait till you see the red clay, and then the next time you see bubbles, push up." The more Scotty wriggled to get free, the faster he sunk. The mud enveloped Scotty to his neck, and he continued staring, unable to articulate anything but a noise like "Ugh!" "And don't panic at the idea that you're being digested. You could live in a rootworm's belly for months." Scotty took one last panicked gasp of air and closed his eyes before he disappeared into the mud. The clerk felt a warmth he hadn't expected all around him. When he opened his eyes, he found that he was entirely surrounded by a translucent goo and was travelling rapidly forward, southward, gliding through the mud as if it were air, skipping along an intricate network of roots. Scotty felt confusion and euphoria in equal measures, madly rushing forward through an alien environment of darkness, spinning around and over the thick, fibrous tentacles of the trees. It was if he were high in the sky at midnight, not deep beneath the swamp in the Underground Express. Looking up slightly at the massive root structure above, Scotty saw something wriggle past, an 8-foot-long, armless, legless, colourless, boneless, eyeless, nearly shapeless creature riding the roots. Something dark was inside of it, and as it came closer, Scotty could see it was an Argonian man. He waved, and the disgusting creature the Argonian was in flattened slightly and rushed onward. Gimulus's words began to reappear in Scotty's mind at this sight. The wintertide migration, airhole, you're being digested. These were the phrases that danced around as if trying to find some place to live in a brain which was highly resistant to them coming in. But there was no other way to look at the situation. Scotty had gone from eating living fish to being eaten alive as a way of transport. He was in one of those worms. Scotty made an executive decision to faint. He awoke in stages, having a beautiful dream of being held in a woman's warm embrace. Smiling and opening his eyes, the reality of where he really was rushed over him. The creature was still rushing madly, blindly forward, gliding over roots, but it was no longer like a flight through the night sky. Now it was like the sky at sunrise, in pinks and reds. Scotty remembered Gimulus telling him to look for the red clay, and he would be near Gideon. The next thing he had to find was the bubbles. There were no bubbles anywhere. Though the inside of the worm was still warm and comfortable, Scotty felt the weight of the earth all around him. Just don't panic, Gimulus had said, but it was one thing to hear that advice, and quite another to take it. He began to squirm, and the creature began to move faster at the increased pressure from within. Suddenly, Scotty saw it ahead of him, a slim spire of bubbles rising up through the mud from some underground stream, straight up, through the roots to the surface above him. The moment the rootworm went through it, Scotty pushed with all of his might upward, bursting through the creature's thin skin. The bubbles pushed Scotty up quickly, and before he could blink, he was popping out of the red, slushy mud. 2 grey Argonians were standing under a tree nearby, holding a net. They looked in Scotty's direction with polite curiosity. In their net, Scotty noticed, were several squirming, furry, rat-like creatures. While he addressed them, another fell out of the tree. Though Scotty had not been educated in this practice, he recognized fishing when he saw it. "Excuse me, lads," Scotty said jovially. "I was wondering if you'd point me in the direction of Gideon." The Argonians introduced themselves as Drawing Flame and Furl of Fresh Leaves, and looked at one another, puzzling over the question. "Who you seek?" asked Furl of Fresh Leaves. "I believe his name is," said Scotty, trying to remember the contents of his long-gone file of Black Marsh contacts in Gideon. "Archean right foot. Rock?" Drawing Flame nodded. "For 5 gold, show you way. Just east. Plantation east of Gideon. Very nice." Scotty thought that was the best business he had heard of in 2 days, and handed Drawing Flames the 5 septims. The Argonians led Scotty onto a muddy ribbon of road that passed through the reeds, and soon revealed the bright blue expanse of Topal Bay, far to the west. Scotty looked around at the magnificent walled estates, where bright crimson blossoms sprang forth from the very dirt of the walls, and surprised himself by thinking, "This is very pretty." The road ran parallel to a fast-moving stream, running eastward from Topal Bay. It was called the Oncobra River, he was told. It ran deep into Black Marsh, to the very dark heart of the province. Peeking past the gates to the plantations east of Gideon, Scotty saw that few of the fields were tended. Most had rotten crops from harvests past, still clinging to wilted vines, orchards of desolate, leafless trees. The Argonian serfs who worked the fields were thin, weak, near death, more like haunting spirits than creatures of life and reason. 2 hours later, as the 3 continued their trudge east, the estates were still impressive, at least from a distance. The road was still solid, if weedy, but Scotty was irritated, horrified by the field workers and the agricultural state, and no longer charitable towards the area. How much further? Furl of Fresh Leaves and Drawing Flame looked at one another, as if that question was something that hadn't occurred to them. Argonian is east, Furl of Fresh Leaves pondered. Near or far? Drawing Flame shrugged non-committally and said to Scotty, For 5 gold, show your way, just east. Is plantation, very nice. You don't have any idea, do you? Scotty cried. Why couldn't you tell me that in the first place when I might have asked someone else? Around the bend up ahead, there was the sound of hoofbeats. A horse coming closer. Scotty began to walk towards the sound to hail the rider, and didn't see Drawing Flame's taloned claws flash out and cast the spell at him. He felt it, though, a kiss of ice along his spine, the muscles along his arms and legs suddenly immobile, as if wrapped in rigid steel. He was paralyzed. The great curse of paralysis, as the reader may be unfortunate enough to know, is that you continue to see and think, even though your body does not respond. The thought that went through Scotty's mind was damn, for Drawing Flame and Furl of Fresh Leaves were, of course, like most simple day labourers in Black Marsh, accomplished illusionists, and no friend of the Imperial. The Argonians shoved Decimus Scotty to the side of the road just as the horse and rider came around the corner. He was an impressive figure, a nobleman in a flashing dark green cloak, the exact same colour as his scaled skin, and a frilled hood that was part of his flesh and sat upon his head like a horned crown. "Greetings, brothers," the rider said to the two. "Greetings, Arch in Right Foot Rock," they responded, and then Furl of Fresh Leaves added, "What is my lord's business on this fine day?" "No rest, no rest," the Archin sighed regally. "One of my she-workers gave birth to twins." "Twins!" Fortunately, there's a good trader in town for those, and she didn't put up too much of a fuss. And then there's a fool of an Imperial from Lord Vannick's building commission I'm supposed to meet with in Gideon. I'm sure he'll want the grand tour before he opens up the treasury for me. Such a lot of fuss. Drawing Flame and Furl of Fresh Leaves sympathized, and then, as Arch in Right Foot Rock rode off, they went to look for their hostage. Unfortunately for them, gravity being the same in Black Marsh as elsewhere in Tamriel, their hostage, Decimus Scotty, had continued to roll down from where they left him, and was at that moment in the Oncobra River, drowning. Decimus Scotty was drowning, and he didn't think much of it. He couldn't move his arms or his legs to swim because of the paralysis spell the Argonian peasant had lobbed at him, but he wasn't quite sinking. The Oncobra River was a crashing force of white water and currents that could carry along large rocks with ease, so Scotty tumbled head over heels, spinning, bumping, bouncing along. He figured that soon enough he would be dead, and that would be better than being in Black Marsh. He wasn't too panicked about it all when he felt his lungs fill with water and cold blackness fell upon him. For a while, for the first time in some time, Decimus Scotty felt peace. Blessed darkness. And then pain came to him, and he felt himself coughing, spewing water up from his belly and his lungs. A voice said, "Oh, bother, he's alive, ain't he now?" Scotty wasn't quite sure if that were true, even when he opened his eyes and looked at the face above him. It was an Argonian, but unlike any he had seen anywhere. The face was thin and long like a thick lance. The scales were ruby red, brilliant in the sunlight. It blinked at him, its eyelids opening and closing in vertical slits. "I don't suppose we should eat you, should we now?" The creature smiled, and Scotty could tell from its teeth that it was no idle suggestion. "Thank you," said Scotty weakly. He craned his head slightly to find out who the we were, and discovered he was on the muddy bank of the still, sludgy river, surrounded by a group of Argonians with similarly needle-like faces and a whole rainbow of scales. Bright greens and gem-like purples, blues and oranges. "Can you tell me, am I near, well, anywhere?" The ruby-coloured Argonian laughed. "No, you're in the middle of everywhere and near nowhere." "Oh," said Scotty, who grasped the idea that space did not mean much in Black Marsh. "And what are you?" "We are Agachefs," the ruby-coloured Argonian replied. "My name is Nomu." Scotty introduced himself. "I'm a senior clerk in Lord Vanek's building commission in the Imperial City. My job was to come here to try to fix the problems with commerce, but I've lost my agenda, haven't met with any of my contacts, the Archons of Gideon. Pompous assimilated slaver kleptocrats." A small, lemon-coloured Agachef murmured with some feeling, "And now I just want to go home." Nomu smiled, his long mouth arching up like a host happy to see an unwanted guest leave a party. "Shays will guide you." Shays, it seemed, was the bitter little yellow creature, and he was not at all pleased at the assignment. With surprising strength, he hoisted Scotty up, and for a moment the clerk was reminded of Gemulus dropping him into the bubbling muck that led to the underground express. Instead, Shays shoved Scotty toward a tiny little raft, razor-thin, that bobbed on the surface of the water. "This is how you travel?" "We don't have the broken wagons and dying horses of our brothers on the outside," Shays replied, rolling his tiny eyes. "We don't know better." The Argonian sat at the back of the craft and used his whip-like tail to propel and navigate the craft. They travelled quickly around swirling pools of slime that stank of centuries of putrefaction, past pinnacled mountains that seemed sturdy, but suddenly fell apart at the slightest ripple in the still water, under bridges that might have once been metal but were now purely rust. "Everything in Tamriel flows down to Black Marsh," Shays said. As they slid through the water, Shays explained to Scotty that the Agachefs were one of the many Argonian tribes that lived in the interior of the province, near the Hist, finding little in the outside world worth seeing. He was fortunate to have been found by them. The Nagas, the toad-like Patru, and the winged Sarpa would have killed him on the spot. There were other creatures, too, to be avoided. Though there were few natural predators in inner Black Marsh, the scavengers that rooted in the garbage seldom shied away from a living meal. Hackwings circled overhead, like the ones Scotty had seen in the west. Shays fell silent and stopped the raft completely, waiting for something. Scotty looked in the direction Shays was watching and saw nothing unusual in the filthy water. Then he realized that the pool of green slime in front of them was actually moving, and fairly quickly, from one bank to the other. It deposited small bones behind it as it oozed up into the reeds and disappeared. "Voriplasm," Shays explained, moving the boat forward again. "Big word. It'll strip you to the bone by the second syllable." Scotty, desirous to distract himself from the sights and smells that surrounded him, thought it a good time to compliment his pilot on his excellent vocabulary. It was particularly impressive, given how far from civilization they were. The Argonians in the east did, in fact, speak so well. The two continued westward through the heart of Black Marsh. Shays showed Scotty the vast, complicated ruins of the Kothringi capitals, fields of ferns and flowered grasses, quiet streams under canopies of blue moss, and the most astonishing sight of Scotty's life, the great forest of full-grown hist trees. They never saw a living soul until they arrived at the edge of the Imperial Commerce Road just east of Slav Point, where Mylik, Scotty's Red Guard guide, was waiting patiently. "I was going to give you 2 more minutes, the Red Guard scowled, dropping the last of his food onto the pile at his feet. "No more, sir." The sun was shining bright when Decumus Scotty rode into the Imperial City, and as it caught the morning dew, it lent a glisten to every building as if they had been newly polished for his arrival. It astonished him how clean the city was, and how few beggars there were. The protracted edifice of Lord Vanek's building commission was the same as it had always been, but still the very sight of it seemed exotic and strange. It was not covered in mud. The people within actually generally worked. Lord Vanek himself, though singularly squat and squinty, seemed immaculate, not only relatively clean of dirt and scabs, but also relatively uncorrupt. Scotty couldn't help but stare at him when he first caught sight of his boss. Vanek stared right back. "You are a sight," the little fellow frowned. "Did your horse drag you to Black Marsh and back? I would say go home and fix yourself, but there are a dozen people here to see you. I hope you have solutions for them." It was no exaggeration. Nearly 20 of Cyrodiil's most powerful and wealthiest people were waiting for him. Scotty was given an office even larger than Lord Vanek's, and he met with each. First among the Commission's clients were 5 independent traders, blustering and loaded with gold, demanding to know what Scotty intended to do about improving the trade routes. Scotty summarized for them the conditions of the main roads, the state of the merchants' caravans, the sunken bridges, and all the other impediments between the frontier and the marketplace. They told him to have everything replaced and repaired, and gave him the gold necessary to do it. Within 3 months, the bridge at Slav Point had disappeared into the muck. The great caravan had collapsed into decrepitude, and the main road from Gideon had been utterly swallowed up by swamp water. The Argonians began once again to use the old ways, their personal rafts, and sometimes the underground express, to transport the grain in small quantities. It took a third of the time, 2 weeks, to arrive in Cyrodiil, none of it rotten. The Archbishop of Mara was the next client Scotty met with. A kind-hearted man, horrified by the tales of Argonian mothers selling their children into slavery, he pointedly asked Scotty if it were true. "Sadly, yes," Scotty replied, and the Archbishop showered him with septims, telling the clerk that food must be brought to the province to ease their suffering, and the schools must be improved so they could learn to help themselves. Within 5 months, the last book had been stolen from the deserted Maran monastery in Follo. As the Arkins went bankrupt, their slaves returned to their parents' tiny farms. The backwater Argonians found that they could grow enough to feed their families, provided they had enough hard workers in their enclave, and the buyer's market for slaves sharply declined. Ambassador Tisley-Yicth, concerned about the rising crime in northern Black Marsh, brought with him the contributions of many other expatriate Argonians like himself. They wanted more imperial guards on the border at Slav Point, more magically lit lanterns posted along the main roads at regular intervals, more patrol stations, and more schools built to allow young Argonians to better themselves and not turn to crime. Within 6 months, there were no more Nagas roaming the roads, as there were no merchants travelling them to rob. The thugs returned to the fetid inner swamp, where they felt much happier, their constitutions enriched by the rot and pestilence that they loved. Sleixth and his constituency were so pleased by the crime rate dropping, they brought even more gold to Decumus Scotty, telling him to keep up the good work. Black Marsh simply was, is, and always shall be unable to sustain a large-scale cash crop plantation economy. The Argonians and anyone else, the whole of Tamriel, could live in Black Marsh on subsistence farming, just raising what they needed. That was not sad, Scotty thought. That was hopeful. Scotty's solution to each of their dilemmas had been the same. 10% of the gold they gave him went to Lord Vanek's building commission. The rest Scotty kept for himself and did exactly nothing about the requests. Within a year, Decumus Scotty had embezzled enough to retire very comfortably, and Black Marsh was better off than it had been in 40 years.